Today I'm here to talk about Jellicoe Road by Melina Marchetti for the second video in my series of young adult book reviews for a class I'm taking for school. Now, if you guys watched my Catcher in the Rye review video, you will kind of know the format of this. Basically, I have a bunch of topics that I have to hit for this review, but I guess to begin, I will give you my initial thoughts. Basically, I have heard so many good things about this book for so many years. It's on so many good best of the young adult book lists. But when I first started this book, I thought I had already read it because it's about this girl named Taylor. She's at a school on Jellicoe Road and she has a kind of mentor adult female figure in her life, this woman named Hannah. Hannah's very mysterious, Taylor's very mysterious. There's a lot of questions about her life because Taylor was abandoned at the 7-Eleven on Jellicoe Road when she was 11 years old, and Hannah was the one who took care of her from that point on. And one day Hannah's gone. When I started this book, I was kind of like, oh, I've read this. It's Paper Towns by John Green. A mysterious girl goes missing, leaving the people behind her to figure out what she was all about and also what they are all about by extent. But the deeper I got into this book, the more I realized that that is not true. This is not John Green. I think by the end of this video I will have figured out how to talk about this book, but I finished this yesterday and I still don't quite know what to say about it. That's how I feel about it. To compare it to the last book I read for this class, I liked it about 70 million times more than The Catcher in the Rye. Maybe because it's a female protagonist. Maybe because it was just more moving. I really love this book. So as with my Catcher in the Rye review, I'm gonna start with a more academic review of Jellicoe Road, and I'm gonna start by talking about the literary techniques used in the book. And the first one I'm going to touch on is character. So I don't know if it's fair to compare Jellicoe Road to The Catcher in the Rye, but I feel like in terms of character, Jellicoe Road was much richer than The Catcher in the Rye, probably because it was a much broader scale. In The Catcher in the Rye, Holden is just running around New York City by himself. In Jellicoe Road, you have the Jellicoe School, the townies, and the cadets all interacting through the territory wars, and that gives room for so much more character and character development. The first character I want to talk about is obviously our main protagonist, Taylor Markham. I related to her voice, I think, a lot more than Holden. Basically, as Taylor develops as a character, all of the supporting characters also develop, because Taylor, at the beginning, sees literally everyone in her life as an acquaintance, as a co-worker, because the territory wars are where the students of the school, the cadets who come through town every year, and the townies all fight over territories in the area. It's a game, but it's also taken very seriously by the kids. She's the leader of the school in terms of the territory wars, and she takes that role very seriously and therefore sees everyone that she interacts with as fellow soldiers in this battle. But as she kind of develops and learns about her past, she starts to accept friendships and make more connections with the people around her, whether that's her fellow students or some of the townies or certain cadets that she's had mysterious past interactions with. And I think her individual growth allowed for greater overall character growth. Some of the other characters that I thought provided a lot of life and added depth and richness to the story were obviously her two fellow students and co-workers, Ben and Raffi. As she grows as a person, they become her friends and she considers them people that she really feels lucky to have in her life. And then we have Jonah. Jonah Griggs is the cadet that she ran away with 2 years ago. She ran away to search for her mother and she met him at the train station. I think I like Jonah, but when we found out that Jonah was at the train station to throw himself in front of the train, it was obviously very moving and it was a very revealing part, but I wish there was a little bit more expansion. Once we found out all about Taylor's past and her life, we expanded on it for a long time and we sat with it. I don't think enough of that was done with Jonah's character, but I also do realize that it's not necessarily Jonah's story. I think he was a really incredible character and human being because even though you consider how much he's been through, he's still so there for her. They talk about romance and how it's not about romance, and it's not. They're romantic together by the end, but he's a great friend to her and he's a great support system to her. I think that's a really awesome thing to show in young adult literature, how someone that you can be romantically involved with can also just be a support system, because if you end up living with them for the rest of your life, you want them to have the capability to be more than just a romantic partner. It's a different kind of love to show in a young adult novel, because all we usually see is the infatuation, the puppy love. And I thought it was really cool to see a much deeper, richer, and more mature romantic relationship. So the next literary element of the story was obviously setting. The story takes place on the Jellicoe Road, which is kind of this little haven. It's definitely its own little world. I feel like I would have loved reading this story when I was like 15 or 16. It was the kind of situation where like the kids were in charge and kind of running their own world, but it was completely believable. Another thing to note about setting was Taylor was abandoned on the Jellicoe Road when she was 11 years old. Throughout the story you kind of see how setting can evolve. The place where she was abandoned was purposeful. Her mother abandoned her there because she knew it would be the best place for her, and it's cool to see how one place can mean so many different things to so many different people. Taylor saw the Jellicoe Road as a place where she was just left, where she was stuck, and throughout the story and her development she begins to see it as a place that she was lucky to be left, and that it was a haven and a beautiful place to be. So the next elements I want to talk about are dialogue and language. I could talk a little bit about, you know, the Australian accents and dialect, but it wasn't really an overwhelming factor in dialogue and language. The bigger thing I want to talk about is the language that was used by the kids. Like, there was literally a point in the beginning where I said, kids don't talk like this. Like, I said I didn't believe it. The way that the students and the kids were talking was too advanced and too adult. By the end of the book, I came to the conclusion that that was because these young people take so seriously this territory war. They act, talk, and walk like adults, and an element of that is the language. So they speak like they're actually discussing and negotiating, and they use all these big words and this big language and this big talk. But that's because I feel like they're all putting on fronts, and when it comes down to it and they start to actually get to know and like each other as friends and as human beings, that language falls away. And so I feel like the language was a really cool tool to show the development of the characters. The last literary element that I want to talk about is conflict. The conflict that I think was most prevalent in this book is something that I could have talked about later, but I'm going to talk about it now in one big thing, and that is the interplay of child protagonists with the world of adults. That was the biggest conflict, the most overpowering conflict in this story, and the only other conflict that I would say was self-discovery. But in my opinion, the path to Taylor's self-discovery was impeded by adults just getting in her way. Taylor believed that her mother didn't even love her because she was abandoned in this way. And if they just told her the truth, she would have had a lot less issues. I really feel like the conflict in this story was caused and perpetuated by adults. Just like adults not thinking that they owe the children anything, the adults making things hard. And maybe that's my young adult perspective. I also feel that about my life, so maybe that's why I find this book so relatable. In some ways I do understand it, because the adults in this story have all been through so much trauma and such an ordeal. They could have prevented so much pain from entering the lives of their children if they had just confronted their pain. I think that's an interesting conflict because it's so true. Adults don't always face their pain, and then they pass it on to the kids in their lives, and then things just continue. I feel like this story was really about facing the trauma in your life, facing the pain in your life, facing it so that you don't pass it on. Okay, so let's wrap this shitstorm up. Let's go. Every one of these literary elements really come together to make such an incredible story. I didn't feel that way when I broke The Catcher in the Rye down this way in my last video, but this time I really feel like character was so well thought out, setting was so well thought out, conflict, dialogue, everything was so well thought out that when they all culminated and came together, it made such a beautiful and moving climax. So now, moving on to thematic issues, I'm going to start with Rites of Passage. There were so many rites of passage in this book, from falling in love, the whole first relationships thing, the whole like between Sant'Angelo and Raffi, like that something between you, don't know how to confront it kind of thing. There was sex in this book, there was first time kind of thing, what does it mean? Again, there was alcohol, the lack thereof. Actually, the kids made the choice to say no alcohol in the clubhouse. Some other rites of passage that I think are much more complex than the typical sex and alcohol and drugs is figuring out who you are in relation to your parents, in relation to the people who brought you up. Differentiating yourself from your parents. I think that's a huge moment in a young adult's life, is seeing that your parents are people too, and respecting that the choices they made are really hard. That's a very huge rite of passage that is not easy. The next one is experiences with death and dying. I feel like there was so much of that in this book. There was so much navigation of death. The fact that Fitz, aka the Hermit, killed himself in front of Taylor. It was such a huge moment in her life. It was such a defining thing for her. It was like, my mother abandoned me, he killed himself, I ran away. Those were the moments of her life. Death obviously played a huge part in that. There was also another moment, if I look through this book I won't be able to find it, but there was a moment when they're talking about a young person that's died, and one of them says, like, it's so unnatural to think that someone our age is dead. It's unnatural. And everyone was facing something like that. I will say that as a young adult person, I found it extremely relatable, and I will tell you why. Because I freaking sobbed for like the entire this part of the book. Like the last 100 pages, you see that there aren't very many notes. I have it in me to write little sticky notes because I was just crying. The last thing that I want to touch on is identity development. I think that Taylor was so closed off and so locked up tight to protect herself. You know, she built walls to protect herself. And I think that had a lot to do with the fact that she didn't understand her past. She didn't understand what her family was. She didn't know the truth about it. Everything in her life was like this huge big question mark. So she just shut herself off so that she wouldn't have any more of those questions. She wouldn't have any more heartbreak. She developed as a character and became her own person and came into her own as soon as she learned about her past, as soon as she learned about her family and her mother and her dad and her aunt. As soon as she learned about their lives, she was able to understand her own and navigate her own and become her own person. That's why I say the conflict was so frustrating, because it just prevented her from moving forward, not knowing her own past. But in the end, she did develop. By the end, it was so nice to see her allowing herself to love. So, to give you my opinions of this book, I totally get the hype about this book now. You know, at the beginning, I didn't really get it, honestly. I was like, this is about a boarding school type of situation and they have territory wars and they're in Australia. What is this? Why is this important? Why does this have this thing on the front? And by the end, I understood that and more. The way I think it's relatable to young adults. It just builds. Like, that's the only way I can describe this book, is it just like starts so simply and it just builds to this like huge, incredible crescendo. I think every young adult person has that crescendo in their life. If you haven't gotten there yet, you're going to. And if you've gotten there already, then this is even more relatable. It's just about that feeling. I really, really, really loved this book. I hope that you enjoyed this review. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon with a new one.